Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our discussion on what are qualitative productivity metrics and how do we measure them. This is a Lead Dev webinar created in partnership with Swarmia. Today's webinar will last about 30 to 45 minutes, after which I and my talented panelists will be over in the Lead Dev Slack channel to answer some of your questions. So please head over there if you want to chat with us afterwards. We may also have time to take some questions live. So if you want to ask a question of these people, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom. And if we can get to them towards the end, we will. Otherwise, catch us in the Slack to catch up. So let's get started with some introductions. My name is Lorna, and today I'll be joined by Rahul and Rebecca to share their experiences and their insight. Unfortunately, we had hoped that Tiffany would be able to join us as well, but she's not able to make it today. So Rebecca, Rahul, I'm going to ask you both to introduce yourselves. Rebecca, you can go first.
Absolutely. So, hey, everybody, I'm Rebecca Murphy. I am the field CTO at Swarmia. Swarmia is a company that makes software to help teams be more productive, help teams and engineering organizations be more productive and understand how they are spending their time and where it's all going.
Rahul, your turn.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Rahul Verma, and I'm a software engineering manager at Meta. I'm working in the cybersecurity team at Meta. Glad to meet you.
We're very glad to meet you. Thank you for coming. So I have brought these excellent humans here to talk to us about productivity metrics and specifically the qualitative productivity metrics for engineering teams. I've got some questions to kind of get the conversation started. But remember, if you have a question for our panelists, you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom to begin. So here we go. Rebecca, I'm going to start with you. This first question is for you. How would you describe the difference between developer experience and developer productivity? Like, what's a good way to think about those two different areas?
Yeah, absolutely. So these terms and other ones get tossed around a lot. You'll also hear engineering effectiveness and other words like that. But I think the main difference between these two things, so productivity is about how work is flowing through the system. So as you pick up a task, how long does it take you to finish that task? What gets in your way along the way? And how is your team supporting you as you're working on that task as well? Because we really think that all things productivity happen at a team level, not at an individual level. Experience, on the other hand, is how does it feel? What's it like? How does it feel to get the work done? If you're trying to do something that should be simple, is it simple? And so thinking about like you should never be in a position where you have to work harder than the business value that you're trying to achieve. Right. And so developer experience is things like how long does it take to run the tests in your code base, or how long does it take for a build to complete, and how often does that build fail? Is it flaky? So lots and lots of things fall under developer experience. At the end of the day, they're both really tightly coupled. They're both about what is it like to produce software at the company where you work. The last thing I'll add to that is we also like to talk about business outcomes when we're talking about productivity and experience, because it doesn't matter if you're having a great time doing the wrong work really fast. So we also like to talk about business outcomes as being a really important kind of third pillar of this whole engineering effectiveness space. But not talking about that today, just wanted to mention it because I think that is it can sometimes be a missing part of the conversation too.
Yeah, I really like that. I think we can sometimes get too hung up on the engineering end of things and, the business part is why we're doing it.
Yes, it is why we're doing it. And I think that has become a much more prevalent concern than maybe it was when interest rates were lower and everybody was hiring everybody as fast as they could.
Yeah. I can add a bit to that. I think Rebecca put it very succinctly, but I think developer productivity is measured in terms of, let's say the outcomes that we are achieving, the turnaround time, the lines of code that we are rolling out, and how fast is the turnaround time. The developer experience actually adds also to the sustainability factor of it. So, we can have a high phase of developer productivity, but if the developers are at the end of the day feeling stressed out and because of the friction in in their experience, uh, for example, friction in the pipelines, for deployment or the test pipelines, then ultimately the developers will end up being burnt out and that productivity cannot be sustained. So it's the good experience that helps sustain the productivity.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that yeah, just like I said, they all go together. If you're thinking about only one of them, then you're probably missing some big opportunities and maybe missing some big challenges that your engineers are facing.
I love that, and I think that's a nice way to kind of frame why are we doing this? Why do we get so hung up about measuring things in the first place? So that was a really great opening. Thank you both for chiming in there. Rahul, this question, I really want to get to pick your brains about how you do measure some of this stuff. Who designs the survey questions that you're using, and how do you know how this is going to fit against other organizations? Like you measure something and maybe you measure how it changes, but how do you decide what to measure, and then how do you kind of get a sense of how that fits?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in big organizations, to design such a survey is not simple because there are different user personas, and there are different ways people want to do their work, and the surveys should cater to everyone. So at Meta, we do have a developer experience team, which is meant to build tools to enable developers achieve higher productivity and a better experience. And that is the team which usually designs the survey, and the survey acts as an input for the team to also define their roadmap. For example, the areas which the developers are feeling should be improved, that goes as an input in building out the roadmap for the team. And these survey questions, of course, will be measuring the current state of things, and also getting insights on what are the friction points, what are the bottlenecks, and then the team works on analyzing the results. And the results are both in qualitative and like the responses are both qualitative and quantitative, and then both of them are analyzed to come up with the next steps and the response to the survey.
Cool. I think that's a really nice insight into how that works. But I want to just follow up with one thing about you measure things and maybe you measure how they change. Do you have a sense of how that same question would look if it was asked to other organizations? Is there like some industry standards for these types of things?
Yeah, great question, Alana. And I'm not aware of industry standards existing for this, even though it would be great to have some industry standards, because sometimes while we may be improving on what we did, let's say last half, but we may still be lagging behind what some of the other industry players are doing. So that kind of comparative measurement will be a good exercise and could motivate us to make further improvements in the developer experience and productivity. But it is not a simple thing to crack, because different organizations have different tooling. They have different domains in which they work, so it's not an apples to apple comparison usually. So, and that is why I think standards have been hard to establish. There have been some traditional standards, like for example, let's say in Java, you would expect a coder to typically, let's say, land about 200 lines of code per day. But all these numbers they lose the meaning without the context. So if you don't add the complexity of the project that they're working on, these numbers may not make sense. So it'll be great to have those industry standards at some point, but I don't think they exist as of now.
Yeah. I think it's really hard to, kind of like Rahul was saying, it's hard to set standards. And one of the things that I like to say is that the best benchmark, the best benchmark is your own baseline. And so you should be seeking, yes, of course, you want to be doing as well as the rest of the industry is, but at the end of the day, if you have miserable developers, doesn't matter that somebody else has less miserable developers, you need to fix that or you're going to lose your developers. So at the same time, at Swarmio, we had a product manager do a deep dive into this. We worked with psychometric analyst people. I don't know exactly what their title is, to develop some survey questions. So there's blog post about that process and the questions that we came up with if people are interested. At Stripe, where I was before, we had a developer experience survey that was just part of a survey that we did a couple times a year to the whole company, beyond engineering as well. But for developers, they got a specific bit. And one of my favorite questions that we ended up asking on that eventually was on a scale of 1 to 10, how productive do you feel? And I want to move that number, right? I want to move that number as close to 10 as I can. We also just asked, like, do the tools that you use make you more productive? So questions like that. But I think it's really important when you're doing surveys to be asking the same questions. You can, of course, introduce new ones, maybe retire some at some point, but having that sort of headline question be the same year to year or survey to survey, I think is really important. So I really like that one. If you could only ask one, well, I don't know. If you could only ask one, I would probably ask, what gets in your way? What's hard about your job? And we also had freeform questions that you'd ask. I'll also, there are lots of, including Swarmia, there are lots of products on the market that are getting into this space as well. This is not necessarily something you have to do yourself. One last thing I'll say is, as far as standards, not quite, but if you aren't familiar already, the Dora group, which is part of Google Cloud, they do an extensive survey every year, and their most recent report just came out. They survey developers across the industry, different sizes of companies, experience, etc. And so that could also be the questions that they're asking. It's all very public and transparent. The questions they're asking may be informative if you're trying to set something up.
Nice. Thank you both. I feel like there was a lot there. And yeah, luckily we can ask more than one question. So you don't have to just choose one. But that would be an amazing constraint to try and operate a department under.
I would say that, with our psychometric fancy friend people, we came up with 32 questions. Please don't ask your developers 32 questions.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you do it exactly once a year. And probably not a lot more. When I was at Indeed, survey fatigue was real. People would use surveys for all sorts of things, and they would get 6 responses and try to draw some conclusion from it. So remember, when you are asking these survey questions, to be conscious of the time that it takes and the expectations that you're putting on people. For example, I know a company that decided to run surveys the week that managers were doing performance reviews. And they were harassing people like every day, why haven't you filled out the survey? And people got really mad. So, be thoughtful about the impact, like how it makes people feel to have to, answer 50 questions about their job.
Yeah, I hope somebody's running a survey about whether anyone has a survey fatigue. I mean, I think that's it. That we've just got very existential there. And Rebecca, I'd like to follow up on that. You've talked a bit about measuring the change. Do you see that people are leaning more on the quantitative metrics that turn into such nice graphs, or do you still use, or is it also useful to use qualitative data in this area? And sometimes do you find that the qualitative things everyone will tell you, and then when you actually try and measure it, can those things be in conflict sometimes?
Yeah, and I think that it's not true that we can't measure these things. So I think that on a scale of 1 to 10, how productive do you feel? look, we just made a number that now we can watch. We can watch that number move from survey to survey to survey. And so I think that we can get creative and think about how we can come up with numbers. A more concrete number that we could talk about, the one that we had at Stripe, was time waiting on machines. How long, when you ask a machine to do something, how long does it take before it's done? And did it error? Those sorts of things. So that was another, like, that became our kind of core developer experience metric. And we were able to make massive changes to systems to move that metric. Another one that we talk about is just, CI time. It's a metric, right? How long does it take from the time that you want to know if your build works to knowing that your build works? I know in Facebook-sized companies, this is like a much more complicated question. But in most companies, of course, you push pull request, you merge pull request, and you want to see the results of that quickly. And so, how long does that take? Is another key experience metric. On the topic of people telling you one thing and finding another, again at Stripe, which is kind of where I got my chops at all of this, Stripe and Indeed. But at Stripe, people were constantly on our survey complaining about meetings and how overloaded they were with meetings. And so we sat down here to like, we can't get rid of meetings. We're not getting rid of meetings. That's not we're not going to have 0 meetings at Stripe. Not all meetings are bad. Some meetings are bad. So we tried to kind of come up with what would a good week look like for a non-staff, non-principal software engineer? What does a good week look like? I forget exactly what the number was, but we came up with if you have 4 days where you have at least 4 continuous hours, you're doing okay. So we used that as kind of our standard. And it turned out that except for staff engineers and this one person who was doing an internship in product or like a loan to product, it was actually okay. I think what you were hearing was more that people don't like meetings, not that meetings were preventing them from getting any work done. And that went from using our BI tools to, we were already ingesting Google Calendar data and all of that. So we were able to use our BI tools to, write some SQL and figure this out. But in the end, I'm going and looking at individual people's calendars and saying looks pretty cool to me. Sorry, you've got stand up. So anyway, I think it is, sometimes people will feel the burden of something, but you're making a business choice that actually, if you have this much free time, it's okay. Forgot my next story. There was another story about people saying one thing and it turns out to be another. But I think that doesn't mean that feeling isn't real. It just means that we're not going to fix that feeling by saying we are cutting half of our meetings, because so you need to figure out maybe this is a meeting quality problem, maybe it's something else, but it's not, from a business perspective, it's not a too many meetings problem.
Cool. And we've actually got a question from the audience that I think fits really well here. It's from Rani. And Rahul, it's following on from what you were saying earlier. Do you also use quantitative measures in your surveys or just the qualitative ones? What's the balance there?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, our surveys do have both qualitative and quantitative questions, and the balance is that sometimes we have a adaptive survey on the basis of if let's say on the quantitative side the response is, let's say, on a question which asks that how long does your pull request has to wait before it gets picked up for review, and let's say the developer who's taking the survey rates that on the lower side, then we may have a follow-up question which will be a qualitative question and ask about any further insights or what they want to add on. And I can share one example, and this is for my team. We observed that the time for which we call it diffs in Meta, we could call it pull request. So we're waiting or waiting to be picked for review was increasing, and through these surveys, of course, we could measure that number from the quantitative question, but it was through the qualitative insights that we knew that it is actually for the complex diffs, the diffs which have a significant or a complex piece of code changed. And for those diffs, it's the time for them to be picked for review is higher because usually it's more work for the reviewer to review that kind of diffs. So and once we found that out, we of course worked out on some mitigation measures. Like we analyzed that the reason why reviewers take longer time to pick those kind of diffs is because they have to build context, understand the reason behind the change, and it takes more time for them. So we took some measures like having some peer reviewers who would already have context about that project, and they could be able to review those diffs faster. But we were able to take these mitigation measures only because of the combination of qualitative and quantitative questions in the survey.
I think that is the constant pattern, right? Is you learn something in a survey that somebody is bothered about something, or that enough people are bothered about something. So your story, Rahul, resonates with me a lot. At Stripe, we got in a situation where the only people who could review certain parts of the code were geographically and therefore time zone wise very far away from the people who needed the review. And so people were complaining about it, so we made sure that we were measuring it and tracking it and looking at it every week. But we also, from there, and this is what I love about these surveys, is from there it's like, well, this is a really fascinating how are we going to fix that? We can train people, we can move people, we can there's lots of ways we can do it. And it became an engineering project to do better, more optimized code review assignment than we had been doing up until then. And we were able to, we set a goal, I think, of we wanted just a review to be picked up within 4 hours. And so that became the job of an engineering team for a quarter or so, was to make sure that your P90 was a certain number of hours to pick up. And then that just becomes a thing that we measure, and we don't necessarily need to ask a specific question about it, because now we can see, and as a business, make a determination. Yeah, I will also say we had a case where a developer was like, my builds reliably take 2 hours every time. I don't know what you're talking about, that builds take 10 minutes. That is not my experience at all. And our head of dev prod was like, that sounds untrue. We've never seen that. But out at P99.9, indeed, there was this developer who was making the types of changes they were making, had this pathological nature that they would tend to require rebuilding the universe. Whereas for most changes, you didn't have to rebuild the universe. So it is, maybe that's the other thing, is it is still important to listen to people, even when you have data that seems to say everything is fine. I don't know whether we ever fixed that person's problem, because it was kind of a pathological one. But that one developer who every day is waiting 2 hours for their build is having a terrible experience, even if everybody else is not.
Nice. That's a nice roundup of how you kind of compare those types of survey results, and then how they can become baked into just metrics. So we're not asking you. We realized we needed to measure it. We got that. We can get that programmatically, whether it's the calendars or it's coming out of the build pipeline. I can get that. I can look at it. I can keep an eye on it. Yeah, I really like that. That's really cool. I want to follow up on the productivity point. And Rebecca, tell me a bit about how you measure those day-to-day experiences for developers and the different ways that they spend their time that can impact their productivity.
So I'm going to push back on that, not in the nicest way possible. I'm going to push back on the premise of the question, which is the idea that we should be measuring individual productivity to begin with. I think, and I saw that there was a Q&A question to this point too. It is very difficult for an individual to control their productivity. Period. There's so much that goes into whether a person is producing output. So maybe that person is working on 10 tasks at once because they have a really bad manager who's not giving them any air cover. They're not going to be productive. That's not their fault that their manager is demanding that they do 10 things at once. Maybe they're getting constantly interrupted by Sev1 incidents. And that feature that they were supposed to ship is nowhere near done. But their product person is not giving them any leeway to do any KTLO work to reduce the number of incidents. So I think, sorry, I get worked up about this. This is kind of my current thing, is that a lot of the productivity challenges that organizations have are culture problems. They are not problems with individuals. Yes, I'm going to admit that, yes, there is probably somebody in your employ. If you have a couple thousand engineers, you've probably got some people who are not pulling their weight. I'm not going to deny that. And most of your productivity issues are cultural. You're asking people to do too many things at once. You're not giving them time to do work that would improve their productivity. You are not investing in CI/CD so that they can actually ship small changes rather than having to work 2 weeks on some massive thing that then goes through, another week of manual QA. So sorry, I really do get worked up about this, because I do think that the inclination is to point at the individual, and to say it's your fault. But that would be like pointing at a machine that's working a queue that you're asking to work on 10 things at once. Of course, it's not going to be performing well. So I think the idea that we can measure individual productivity is kind of it's very misleading. Or even that we should be measuring individual productivity, or this thing about ghost developers and all that. If you have somebody, most people don't enjoy doing nothing. So if you have somebody doing nothing, that may be a cultural organizational problem, not a problem with that individual. So yeah, small batch sizes, limit work in progress, finish what you start, spend time improving the system, not just building new things for your customers. If you do those things, you will be productive. If you don't do those things, you will not. And so, yeah, I think, again, the idea that we can point at an individual developer, and I saw somebody also asked about, staff engineers. Like a staff engineer, I might be totally happy letting them play video games half the day, as long as they come to the meeting and say the thing and point at the line of code that I need changed. And is that a cultural problem too? Yes, we should, documentation, et cetera, et cetera. But that again is a cultural problem. It's not the fact that you've ended up with this irreplaceable resource is that's the organization's problem to deal with. It's not, and until they do, you might actually want to keep that person around. That's my soapbox speech. Sorry.
Yeah, I can add a bit to that. Because I completely agree with Rebecca that the developer productivity or the experience metrics cannot be used as a way to, for example, benchmark an individual's performance. And that can definitely not be the right criteria. And it is never used in the organizations that I worked with. For the question that we had from the audience about staff engineer or principal engineers, how do we measure their productivity? Because their the volume of the code that they roll out is generally low. So yes, I agree that that definitely happens, and that is why we do not use these metrics to measure individual productivity. Because if we see our senior engineer bandwidth is like a rare currency, and we would want to use that in the most effective way. So, for example, and I've seen it in multiple ways. So I have examples where a senior engineer rolled out in a very low number of diffs, but when they actually did it, the impact was huge. So they actually targeted the right area. And even sometimes, with just a few lines of code, the impact achieved was huge. So that is one way senior engineers differentiate generally, from the other engineers. The other way is also, of course, while they may not be landing a lot of code themselves, but they would be using their expertise in defining and helping lay out the roadmap for rest of the team on strategically, what should be the areas that the team should be working on, creating, like, removing the blockers in that path, and building clarity. So that is how senior engineers generally contribute, and that is why these metrics cannot be the only criteria. The purpose of these metrics is definitely that to identify areas which we can improve for the developers. So it's definitely to, I think, someone, Lucas in the audience asked this question, that so the purpose is to actually empower the developers. This is not like a checker or a sword hanging on their head, because we are knowledge workers. We are not working in factories, and we don't measure that how many number of products we are not an assembly line. So that's the thing. Yeah.
We are not an assembly line. Wouldn't it be great if you could just add more people and it would all just happen? Faster computers, yeah, that'll help. It does, but not quite the way that you think. We've got really into the data here, and I'm enjoying this coverage of both, the productivity, the stuff that we measure, and the stuff that we measure through surveys. But Rahul, I'd like to talk to you a bit more about how you work with the data. Do you need a lot of statistics knowledge to do this kind of thing? Do you work with data specialists? How do you make sure that you're doing the right thing to interpret the data? Because it can be quite complex, right?
Yeah, that's right. And it also depends on the way the survey is structured. Ideally, we should strive to have a simpler survey and think about, like, while designing the survey, we should also think about how are we going to analyze the results and how are we going to interpret the insights into defining what outcomes we want. So, and it also depends on the resources that the organization may have. If we do have the privilege of having data scientists, then of course data scientists can definitely help us uncover some insights which we may miss out. But I would say for most developer experience surveys, we should be able to analyze them even without like specific expertise from data scientists. But in some cases, for example, if we want to do surveys or analyze data which has a control element and a test element to it, and we want to drive out some advanced metrics like standard deviation as compared to previous survey, and then I think some data scientist bandwidth would help. But a simple comparison and a simple analysis, I hope like whoever is designing the survey should be able to do it.
Yeah, and I think it is important to understand the difference between stuff like median and mean, and to understand when you want to use, a P80 number and when you want to use the median or when you want to use the mean. It's important to kind of just grasp what all of those different things are. I got real good at SQL. That was probably the thing I had to learn was just number one, learning all the data that we had, and then learning, like, I had to get much better at SQL than I had been as a front-end developer up until that time. So, but I agree, like, data scientists are always a great addition to this, but you don't need, like, we have a fairly small engineering organization. We're running surveys, and we just look at it and talk about it. So I think, like, at a Meta-sized or a Stripe-sized company, Stripe was like 2,000 engineers when I was there, and Meta's obviously much larger. You might want to do more cohorting and, like, deeper analysis, but for a smaller business, truly you can just ask the questions and make some graphs in Excel if if you want to keep it simple. So yeah, I think special expertise is not required to get value out of these.
Okay, that's reassuring. The thing that I needed to learn, I'm already pretty good with SQL. I've always been a back-end developer, but because I did engineering, I know a lot more calculus than I do statistics, and I found that was a little bit of there were some mysterious keywords that I had to properly go in textbook so that I could apply them correctly. Like, okay, I've calculated a thing, but what does that mean? What do I do with this knowledge? So funny to hear you say that, the opposite way around. And I think these are very multidisciplinary things. We've had a few questions in and we're running a little bit short of time, but I definitely have time to ask you one more thing, which is about how do you get people to engage with the surveys that you run? When you're measuring those things from inside the business, you're measuring on the build pipeline or calendars or whatever, team sizes, that's real data. But when you're running a survey, and like you say, developers, there's a risk that people get tired of it, or how do you help the audience that you need to reach engage with the work that you're trying to do? I'm going to start with you, Rebecca, and then let's go to Rahul as well, because I want to hear from both of you on this.
Very tricky when both of our names start with an R. I really don't know what you're going to say until you get to the end. Sorry. I think that, can you say the question again? Because I just got all tripped up trying to figure out whether I was about to answer it or not.
Yeah. If your name begins with R, answer this question.
Yes.
Wow, my
fatigue, survey fatigue, right?
Yeah, how do you help people engage with your
got it. I did know the answer. So I was actually thinking about this just before you asked this question. I wanted to talk about how so much of this is kind of a product job. Your developers are your users, and the environment that they work in is your product. Sorry that nobody actually designed that environment. Oops. But that's your product. Your product is the tools that they have to use every day to get their job done. And so I think that when it comes to survey fatigue, it's really important to make visible that you're listening and that you are acting. If you ask me what makes me miserable, and me and all of my developer friends tell you that it's build times, and you don't do something about that, I'm not going to want to answer your survey next time, especially if you ask me 50 questions on it. Because why should I trust that this is a good use of my time? So I think number one is showing motion toward improvement and showing investment toward improvement. I think another thing is giving people agency to fix the things that bother them when they have the ability to fix them, and that too is going to make this a much more engaging thing. We had very high survey participation at Stripe, high 90s, high 90% survey participation, but it's because after that survey, we were talking about it in the all hands next week. We were talking about it in our teams. There was a whole developer productivity organization of a couple hundred engineers, I think, that went to work on okay, now what? What are we going to do about this, and set goals around it? So I think that is just showing that you're going to actually take action is probably one of the biggest things that you can do to limit survey fatigue. And I think what we did is we ran the whole company twice a year, and then every month we would hit a third of the developers with a smaller survey. So we were surveying constantly, but we weren't surveying everyone all the time. So that's another thing to think about. Again, probably doesn't make sense if you have 100 engineers, but if you have a couple thousand, it might make sense to just be sampling throughout the year and just getting everyone at one time. But I do think thinking about this whole problem as these are your users, your product is the tools that they use, is the way they get their work done, and bringing a product mindset to this. And I think that is what that's why I love this work, is because it is so multidisciplinary. It really does it tickles my marketing brain, my product brain, my engineering brain, all of it. But yeah, I think showing movement is how you get traction.
I love that. Rahul, do you want to speak to that as well? How do you get people to like be with you in the work that you do?
Yeah, this is, of course, survey fatigue is real, and it's not easy to get people to take these surveys. Some of the things that have worked and would usually work is, one is that you try to keep the surveys crisp and short. There is a significant dropout rate for surveys which take more than, let's say, more than 5 minutes, or in some cases more than 10 minutes. So try to keep the surveys, like, not try to extract all the information about everything in just one survey. You could phase out like focus areas of the surveys. And I think it helps to get inputs from a higher percentage of users rather than like having a huge survey taken only by a few users. So that is one. Of course, the second thing is that usually, and these surveys are not a one-time thing. We know that we will be doing follow-up surveys. Now, how to ensure the participation rates in the follow-up surveys is by making sure that you follow up and follow through on what was the outcome of the first survey. So, you share that what was the analysis that was done, what were the actions that were taken, and then the developers will also start to see value that the inputs that they are giving are being acted upon. So they feel more invested into taking parts in this survey. So, and of course, like some other things have also been used, tools like small incentives. Like I remember at Meta once, it was for a developer experience survey itself that we encouraged people to participate, and everyone who takes the survey will get a T-shirt. But usually, I think even this should not be required. It's mainly about making developers feel invested and a part of it. Because this is very important, can make significant differences in overall organization's productivity. And I think building some champions in leadership, who can share and talk through about the survey and emphasize on the importance of taking it, that also helps.
Such great points there. And for me, coming into the developer experience, following a developer advocacy role, which is also very multidisciplinary, I think there's a lot of transferable skills, and you definitely need to have a lot of things in mind and close a lot of feedback loops, as well as doing that kind of hard data work as well. So that is all we have time for in today's session. I knew it was going to be good, but I have had such great insights from both of you. This has totally exceeded my expectations, and I really hope that everybody watching this has had a great time as well. Thank you, both of you, so much. We are all now going to head over to the Lead Dev Slack. So hopefully everybody watching is registered there. We will be in the Effective Teams channel. So please head over to Effective Teams. We'll pick up any questions that we didn't get to during the session. We can chat more about all these topics. And thank you very much for joining, and I hope we'll see you next time. Thank you.